Okay, so this is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We are picking up from page 87 of the translation. So we're a few sessions into chapter 5, where we're looking at the origin of information specifically. So we've talked about the mathematical theory of information that he's sort of taking as a starting point here, and he's going to present or he's already presented some criticisms of maybe a kind of overextension of this theory. So just to give a sort of quick recap of that theory. So this mathematical theory of information or communication theory arises out of problems having to do with engineering of telephone systems. So as a company running a telephone system, you have to spend money on laying wires between different households or different phones, I guess, and different cities, etc. And so obviously you want to minimize how much money you're spending on laying these wires, but at the same time you need to ensure that you have enough of these wires to have all the phone calls be comprehensible and be transmitted correctly. So the sort of engineering problem is like, what is the minimum amount of wire you need to be able to convey all the information required to transmit a voice from one end to the other. And so there's the famous Shannon and Weaver book that sort of presents this mathematical theory of information for the first time. And so it's based on information content of a message as being sort of the reciprocal of the probability of this message. So if you think of a sort of like the simplest possible message would be just the result of a coin flip. So you have either heads or tails, or 0 or 1, whatever, this sort of binary choice, and you just transmit which of these two possibilities was the result of that coin flip or binary choice. And so in this case, the medium or the wire, whatever it is, radio waves, it has to at least be able to have two separate states that can be distinguished from each other. So you have to have, a high and low voltage or high and low frequency, whatever it is, that allows the person on the receiving end to, take those two states and understand which one corresponds to heads and which one corresponds to tails. And then at the receiving end, that person will know whether the coin was heads or tails. And so this is obviously the most sort of basic form of information transmission. So you have one bit or one sort of unit of information being transmitted in this case. And then if we think of something a bit more complicated, like say the letters used in the Roman alphabet plus some punctuation signs and a space, etc. So maybe like 50 characters. Then you would have a message of, say, n characters length, and each of those characters could be one of those 50. So you have 50 to the power of n, n to the power of 50 possible messages that could be transmitted from the transmitter, and then so the channel has to be able to distinguish these 50 possible characters, and then at the receiving end you have to be able to decode those states in the medium or channel and reconstruct the message. Of course, with a normal, a natural language like English, the different characters are not all equally probable at the transmitting end. So we of course, the letter E is much more common than the letter X, and then also combinations of characters are not all equally probable either. Like Q, X, Z is not an English word or a sequence of characters that would occur in any English word. And so, like, given if you know that letter or character 1 of the message is a Q, then the probability that character 2 will be a U is very high. And so, given these, given the fact that the individual characters are not all equally probable, and then the sequences of characters are not all equally probable, it means you can sort of compress the message is conveying less information than if all the characters and all the sequences of characters were all equally probable. There's a certain redundancy in the message, and that allows you to sort of compress. This is sort of what, in a much more complicated way, that you have compressed audio formats, for example, that will sort of take advantage of the redundancy in the original audio signal and allow some of that redundancy to be removed so that you can have a smaller file, and then at the output end you can sort of reconstruct what the original audio would have sounded like. But this, and this is something we discussed a lot during the Simon Don reading. This notion of information is also a little bit paradoxical because, like I mentioned, the English, an English text, English sentence, whatever it is, that makes sense and sort of conveys information in the normal sense of the word. Telling someone, buy this stock or I don't know, go to this place at this time, whatever. This message has a lower content of information in the mathematical sense than just a string of characters with no obvious pattern or meaning, because given the redundancy in the message, you can compress it relative to the original string of characters, and so the message that we would consider meaningless contains more information than the message that actually conveys important information in sort of the colloquial sense of the term. So I think both Simondon and Ruyer take this sort of discrepancy between the colloquial sense of information and the mathematical sense of information to be sort of a warning sign that we shouldn't extend, or we shouldn't take the mathematical theory of information, this sort of communication theory concept of information, to be applicable outside of this specific technical domain, and to be sort of like a sort of account of the nature of information in general that we can rely on for to understand thought and biological organisms and all these things that cyberneticians wanted to be able to do with these types of concepts. And this also gets into problems about like what does it mean for something to be ordered versus random. When we talked about that last time, that like it's actually quite difficult to produce like a random sequence of numbers, or generate put together a process that you can consider to be random in some sense. Like even when you get a computer to generate a random number, it's actually not random. It's a kind of pseudo-random process that involves like using the least significant digits of a large number. Just something that where the precise number is not really that important. It just sort of takes that and uses it to create a number that seems random, but in principle you could calculate in advance what pseudo-random number the computer would generate. So like in some applications, in terms of like cybersecurity, for example, generating a number that is random enough is actually quite important. Where like a number that should be random but isn't could lead to a security vulnerability if someone is capable of reconstructing how that pseudo-random number was generated. And we also talked about how Bergson also has similar arguments about like the nature of order and randomness, and how for him these are sort of relative concepts. Like for him, it doesn't make sense to say something is like purely random or purely unstructured. We can only say that like some state, some system is not in an order that we expected, or an order that we think it should have, or something like that. But like to say that something is in an absolute sense not ordered doesn't really make sense for him. These are all sort of the questions that are sort of behind this notion of the cybernetic sort of information theoretic account of biological structure, psychology, the nature of thought, etc. So they sort of take this technical notion of information and try to run with it to explain all these things that had previously been considered to be obscure, and they think that they can sort of like take this technical notion and just clear up all these obscure problems about what is thought and so on. But what Ruyer is sort of showing here is that this technical notion of information is also relying on these quite obscure concepts of order and randomness and so on. Okay, so we can continue from page 87 if someone would like to read from there.
I can read. So we're on number 2. We can easily see the importance of this distinction between two senses of the word order for the problem of the origin of information. The supposed initial state of the universe, with free energy maximized and entropy minimized, represents a homogeneous order and not a structured order. This initial state resembles text 2. It does not contain more information than a pure chaos, which would be similar to text 1. We therefore understand and agree with the scientists who have not taken seriously the theologians and philosophers who have claimed to find the trace of the finger of a quote-unquote clockwinder, God, in this initial state. We can easily imagine some models of the universe as a curve or a torsion such that the apparent loss of homogeneous order finds itself compensated, because homogeneous order is always relative to the chosen reference. To give a basic but clear example, if an explosion takes place at point 0 in a spherical space, the debris of the explosion ends up joining back with itself and converging at the antipodium, like in the reversed film that represents this explosion. In such a space, entropy, or a related quantity, therefore, only increases up to a certain maximum, after which it decreases. In the same way, the water that makes the mill work can be used again if a lower level is available. It is true that on our planet, the sea level marks an impassable limit, but in the universe in general, it is not easy to see what could play the role of a quote-unquote sea level. The physicists were therefore right not to be concerned about the theological problem, the entropic upward movement, and the origin of homogeneous order. But they would be very wrong to imagine that the problem of the origin of information and structural order is just as untroubling. No curvature or torsion of the universe can automatically rebuild a mill or resurrect them. The profound difference between homogeneous order and structured order makes the proposed solution of coupled systems completely futile. For it to be effective, the coupled elements must be of the same nature. A man whose job is to write letters may be assisted in his work by a secretary or by a guide to commercial correspondence, but he is not sensibly aided by increased nutrition, a flow of quote-unquote free energy that passes into his system. This current of quote-unquote negative entropy does not help him put his ideas in phrases, and it may even do the opposite if he eats too much and has digestive problems. Of course, if he is deprived of nourishment, if he rations his food and does not get enough calories, he cannot work, just as a mill stops if it dries up. But we must not confuse the dynamic, the flow of force, and structural. Stopping the current stops the mill, but does not make it falter. The return of the current starts it again, but does not repair it if it is damaged. The living organism, being mostly constituted of subordinated machines, obeys the general laws of ethics. If I have a horse that bears a load, it is necessary that I feed, just as it is necessary that I put fuel in a car. If I want it to, a horse, and even a person who climbs a hill, only superficially contravenes the second law of thermodynamics, since it is quote-unquote coupled with the flux of energy of its food. We readily agree. But a man composing a message on the telephone, who is apparently the source of information, poses a completely different problem. One cannot explain the information in the message by quote-unquote information in the sense of quote-unquote homogeneous order, nor by the organized chemical energy in his food. If we connect a supplementary electric motor to a telephone, we change the background noise. For example, we make it more, but we do not make it speak intelligently. This change of background noise, like the local heating of the metal bar in the first example, can give me the information that a new motor has been. In the same way, the Doppler effect informs astronomers of the radial speed of the stars. But in order to explain the infinitely more complex information of a message, we must have recourse to an order of the same or similar degree of complexity, to a structured, not a homogeneous order. The coupling, quote, field of fluctuations plus homogeneous order gives only a, quote, field of fluctuation. This coupling cannot provide the equivalent complex modulation. The same goes for the principle of relativity. Its significance is very limited, and the invariants that it leaves intact are the essence of the universe. According to the movements of the observers, one sees at the end of a train a red carriage where the other sees a green rhombus, but the order and the structural arrangement of the train and of the travelers is the same for the observer. The difference of their movements cannot transform a mountain of the Pacific or a male traveler. Maybe I should stop there because it's the next section that goes to close to the end of the subsection. So this distinction between different kinds of order. So as I understand it, one of the points that he's making is that just the fact that you are adding energy to a biological system and body may be, a necessary condition for that human being to produce a message that be understood by another human being, but it isn't sufficient to explain the level of order of the message that is transmitted. I think that argument makes sense to me. For instance, somebody who is like healthy enough and adequately fed could spend the afternoon watching TV, or they could spend the afternoon studying math and maybe have an insight into some issue in philosophy of mathematics. But the fact of their being well fed and their metabolism operating properly alone doesn't explain the difference between those two activities, one of which produces a high degree of order, very complicated order, and the other does not.
Yeah, and I think you can even make like a more sort of direct opposition that, like, the person sitting at the desk, writing down this, a proof of a new mathematical theorem, for example. There's a certain amount of energy being expended in the sense that there are chemical bonds, the chemicals that they got from their food, for example, that are being broken, and the energy is being released so that their muscles can move, and neurons are firing, etc. All this is happening, but then someone else who is sitting at the desk and I don't know, drawing, just sort of doodling on a page, drawing whatever lines and scribbling, etc., and not really doing anything that has any sort of significance or information in the more colloquial sense of the term. These two people are probably spending the same amount of energy or similar amount of energy in terms of breaking chemical bonds and releasing the energy that was contained in the food these two people had consumed. But one person is producing something that generates this order or this structure, this mathematical theorem that was not known before has now been proved. Whereas the other person is just sort of aimlessly drawing lines on a page. And so it seems pretty clear that you can't explain the difference between these two cases in terms of some in terms of the order that was contained, or this negative entropy that was contained in the food that they consumed, the sort of influx of the chemical bonds that they can break down to move their muscles and so on. There's something distinct between these two cases that is not reducible to a difference in the flow of energy through the system. And even more, like, you have the one person at the desk proving a theorem, you have someone else doing jumping jacks for an hour. The second person, the one doing jumping jacks, is going to expend a lot more energy, but at the end of the hour has not really, I mean, you could say that they've sort of achieved something in the sense that maybe their muscles and aerobic fitness and so on have taken on, this is maybe training them to develop in a certain way, but they haven't sort of increased the amount of order in the world in any sort of notable sense, whereas the person who has proved the theorem has generated this order that didn't exist before. So it's this sort of attempt to explain the origin of information or the origin of order in terms of a sort of pre-existing order that would be, for example, in the food that the person has consumed. This sort of becomes less and less plausible the more you sort of look at these different examples. Yeah, exactly. You have to find the right cereal that whose chemical bonds actually contain all the proofs in them, and then you just have to digest them in the right way, and then the proofs come out. Yeah, it's the cornflakes philosophy of mathematics. But yeah, I think these examples with the mill are also quite helpful because, yeah, so you have a mill, with a water wheel. This is like 18th century England, sort of proto-industrialization time. If the stream dries up, the wheel stops, but when the stream comes back, like, the stream itself did not create the mill. The flowing of the stream did not make the mill appear in this place. Even if the flow of this water in the stream is necessary for the mill to function, it doesn't mean that the order that is the mill being, having the water wheel and being structured in this way, is not a result of the flow of the water. And so likewise, in the case of the person, the presence of this negative entropy, necessary but not sufficient, exactly. So the presence of the negative entropy in the food, the chemical bonds in the food that the person consumes, is definitely necessary. That it's generally pretty hard to prove mathematical theorems when you're starving, and once you're actually dead, it's impossible as far as we know. Maybe there's posthumous proving going on that we are not aware of, but once the person is dead, they are not proving any theorems in our world, at least. Maybe Good managed to do that. It's kind of a tragic case. So once you need to have the negative entropy, taking in the chemical bonds in your food to be able to prove the mathematical theorems. But that doesn't mean that the flow of this negative entropy into your body is itself the source of those mathematical theorems. The flow of negative entropy is like the water, and then the order here that is required to prove the theorem is sort of the equivalent of the mill here, which is needs the water to operate but is not produced by the water.
Yeah, maybe even like setting aside the issue of like complex mathematical and philosophical inventions, just the order in the human body is also significantly different, obviously, from the water just passing through the water wheel turn, because it's not, the energy from the food isn't just passively moving through the body, actively built back up, reallocated in a different place or in a process of maintaining mechanism.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, this would maybe get into some of his other writings. Like I'm also reading his Elements of Psychobiology at the moment. But he does sort of allow that the human body or any other animal body is made up of machines, in the sense that you have like the membranes of cells, like nerve cells, for example, will they have sort of like almost like micro gates that allow ions to pass in one direction or the other, and actually use energy to make ions cross this boundary, for example. And this is what produces the charge across the membrane in a neuron. So you have like these sort of like micro machines inside of a cell, and then the cell itself is has maybe a sort of machine function in the organ as a whole, etc. So like you have these, the maybe like the bone muscle combination in the leg, in like the femur, is essentially a lever, etc. All these like sort of machines that make up the body. So it's not that these are not machines, but I think what he's getting at here is that you can explain a lot of the functioning of a human body or any other animal body in terms of the operation of these machines, but you can't explain the origin of machines purely in terms of machines. That like we have, say, like the embryo, or sort of the fertilized egg, to start at the beginning, doesn't have all these machines. There's no leg in the fertilized egg, but over the course of its development process, it produces a leg, so the machines are not there at the outset, and it's only through this process of development that it sort of makes itself into something that has all these machines inside it, so because of that sort of developmental process, in which something that is not a machine, or is not yet a machine, sort of becomes mechanical, becomes machine-like, in a partial respect, or it comes to have machines within it. It's that distinction that I think he's insisting on. So in this case, it would be like you have the mill, you have the stream, with no mill next to it, and then over the course of time, the mill appears. In the case of the mill, it obviously requires a person or group of people to bring in materials and put them together in a certain way to produce a machine that can then be run by the mill, by the stream. In the case of the organism, it's a little bit different, of course, because there's no sort of outside agent that comes in and puts the different biological machines together, or the components of these biological machines together to produce an organism. The organism sort of builds itself out of this material and energy coming in. But once the organism is built, and even probably before it reaches the adult form, but once it has like structures of some kind, those structures are themselves machines that function just by taking in negative entropy and breaking down chemical bonds to make those machines function. So I think it's not so much a distinction between something that is not a machine versus something that is a machine, but rather a distinction between machines that build themselves, or something that builds machines for itself, versus something that a machine that has to be built by something else.
Yeah, it's interesting. Increasingly, I'm on the basis of some of the biology stuff that I've been learning. It's more and more difficult for me to see something like a cell in terms of. I mean, there are like proteins, for instance, that have like rotor heads, which are pretty obviously machine-like, but just the fact that they're transcribed through this complex transcriptome interaction and sort of themselves react to the overall state of the cell. I mean, I haven't read. I'm planning to read his The Genesis of Living Forms, and yeah, maybe he does see all of this as just very complicated machinery. But some of the biologists I've been reading argue that there really isn't any machine that we know of that functions in the way that a cell does, by producing its own parts in this complicated transcription and transcription regulation process. In development and metabolism. But I don't. There are certainly aspects of it, of cell function, that seem mechanical, but then the metaphor seems to break down in other places. But I don't know enough about his other work. It just sees them as self-building machines.
Yeah, I think maybe I think you would probably distinguish between the cell being made up of machines, or having machines as components on the one hand, and then the cell being a machine on the other hand, because he this is sort of like one of his kind of central, I think, metaphysical commitments or principles, is that there are these sort of autonomous entities, something like an organism, or in his case also the elementary particles, are these sort of autonomous entities that have this sort of self-producing character to them. So the cell would not be a machine in the sense that the mill, for example, is a machine, but the cell would consist of machines, or would be made up of machines. And it's precisely the fact that the cell has this self-directing, self-producing sort of autonomy, whereas the mill is produced by the person who comes and puts together all these parts in a certain way. And it's interesting that you bring up this concept of like a self-producing machine, because there's a sort of a famous paper from John von Neumann, who was associated with the Cybernetics group. He attended some of the Macy conferences, but I don't think he was ever like sort of a central participant, or considered himself to be a cybernetician, for example. But he has a paper on a design for a self-producing machine, how you could like create a machine that would produce copies of itself. And this is sort of a sort of proto concept for the sort of field that's now known as synthetic biology. But yeah, I think the distinction between a machine or something made of machines and a self-producing entity like an organism, or even a cell within an organism, is sort of like the key concept, or one of the key concepts of Ruyer's work. This idea of like autonomous entities that have their own sort of self-contained subsistence, and produce themselves on the one hand, and then these sort of I guess, agglomerations of entities that might be, they might have a certain structure. Like the mill is made up of, different entities that have their own structure. It's not just a sort of random assortment of materials, but at the same time, the mill is not itself a sort of unified entity. It has no sort of for itself existence. It's just parts that happen to be connected in a certain way to produce certain effects. And Bats has put a comment here about the influence of the concept of a Turing machine, for example. And this is also interesting because Turing has a paper on morphogenesis, the production of form, which at the time I think was not that well received, or it wasn't like really, there wasn't that much attention to it at the time. But it's only more recently that people have sort of gone back to that paper and seen it as quite important. So it's like, and this is something we were talking about just before we started recording, about how like these, you have like diffusion of chemicals across, or down a gradient, for example, but you have like different chemicals that interact with each other in these complicated ways and produce patterns that maybe would seem like they should be sort of directed by some sort of form, like a geometrical pattern of stripes or squares or whatever, that it seems like it would need to be sort of imposed on the organism from the top down. That there would have to be some sort of like directing agency that would produce stripes on the body of this organism, for example. But when you sort of look at it more closely, you see that the stripes are the result of just this sort of interaction of different chemicals being diffused across the skin of the organism in a certain way and interacting with each other. So I think this sort of morphogenesis concept is an attempt to explain the order that we find in organisms in terms of just this sort of interaction of these sort of elementary processes, and this is like, Ruyer, I think, takes this kind of explanation to be important and potentially correct in certain cases, but also to be kind of like misguided as an attempt to explain order in general. Oh, I haven't seen that quote from Turing. Yeah, the stripes are easy, but what about the horse part? So this is about zebras, I guess, that like, yeah, you can explain the why a zebra has stripes, or like how the stripes form on the zebra, but that sort of presupposes that you already have the like basic horse body plan, or equid body plan developed, and then you're just trying to figure out where the stripes come from. But yeah, the hard part is like, where does this body plan come from in the first place? That's obviously much harder to explain in terms of different chemicals interacting with each other. So yeah, I think for Ruyer, he sees the stripes, the formation of stripes through this interaction of different chemicals would be a kind of machine in the like a stripe generating machine in the skin of the zebra. And he's not denying that there are machines in a zebra's body, for example. But he is denying that the whole zebra would be a product of machines in the same way. So yeah, it's the difficulty of the horse part, or the equid body plan part of the zebra, explaining that in terms of machines, that I think he's insisting on. Okay, we can go on to the next bit if someone else would like to read from Roman numeral 4.
Yeah, I can read. Okay. 4. It is true that the physicists mentioned, notably Schrödinger and Bloom, claim to explain the structural information itself by some quote-unquote mutations or fluctuations retained and reproduced indefinitely. The flow of force the sunlight constitutes explains, by energetic coupling, the endothermic synthesis of carbohydrate. However, the bombardment by the most energetic photons over millions of years of evolution would explain the progressive constitution of photoplasm capable of utilizing sunlight. This time, we cannot reproach this theory for being beside the point of the problem. However, it rests on some flagrant error, both biological and psychological, and on a quite rudimentary philosophy. I will simply mention here the biological errors that we have discussed at length elsewhere. Genes, mutated or not, are not quote-unquote patterns, clichés, that transfer their order to the macroscopic organism through impression. They most likely act through the intermediary of hormones or substances with an analogous role. since one can suspend their action with other chemical substances. They act as modulators of a given form. It is more than doubtful that genetic mutations are the unique key to the evolution of species. On the other hand, the biologist physicists are unaware of the most certain results of experimental embryology, which have revealed the extent of possible regulations in development and the thematic character of this development. We can further expand on the psychological errors. Psychological invention, the creation of information, certainly has nothing in common with Brownian motion, either closely or remotely. In the famous passage where Henri Poincaré describes the psychological circumstances of some of his mathematical discoveries, he uses a playful metaphor, comparing the mental agitations that precede invention to the Democritian chaos of hooked atoms. But it is clear that this semi-humorous metaphor does not coincide with the details of his own account. The important point is always the presentiment, or thematic apperception of isomorphism. Open quote. When we arrived at Constance, we got into a break to go for a drive, and, just as I put my foot on the step, the idea came to me, though nothing in my former thoughts seemed to have prepared me for it, that the transformations I had used to define function were identical with those of non-Euclidean geometry. End quote. Then open quote again. One day, as I was walking on the cliff, the idea came to me, again with the same characteristics of conciseness, suddenness, and immediate certainty, that arithmetical transformations of indefinite ternary quadratic forms are identical with those of non-Euclidean geometry. End quote. It is clear that the essential thing is the putting into correspondence of some ideas according to some thematic isomorphism, and not the agitation of mental quote-unquote atoms in the unconscious. Should I go on?
Yeah, maybe you can read one more paragraph.
Okay. Psychological invention, like the development of biological differentiation, goes from meaningful theme to meaningful theme. The man who improvises a message on the telephone first has a general idea of what he wants to communicate. This general theme evokes linguistic habits that are themselves abstract, which control the phonetic effectors and the specialized memories of the vocabulary, in the same way that embryonic locomotor rhythms precede and envelop the more specific reflexes of the limbs. Psychologists' efforts to capture invention at its source, for example to capture the birth of a hypothesis, have failed. But we can capture more easily the minor invention that is the recovery by a conscious being of an altered or degraded information. A machine, we have seen, is incapable of this. There is no automaton to correct printing errors. If a record has a material fault, this fault is aggravated on its listener, but the listener, attentive to the meaning, mentally corrects the fault. When an old manuscript has been frequently recopied by copyists who are unintelligent or who work mechanically, the faults usually tend to worsen, just like the faults of the record, although an ingenious philologist may succeed in recovering the original text. This psychological regulation, just like biological regulation, is linked to the thematic character of the true information. The apprehension of meaning, enveloping and dominating the subordinated material, is independent of the later's imperfection. The relation envelops the quote-unquote correlates and can reconstitute. The informed being, as well as the informing being, participates in the domain of meaning, as the organism does in the domain of specific themes, and that is why it can correct the letter of a message. Mechanical communication has no other role as a tool in human activity than to aid the receiver in finding the meaning by himself. It is for information as it is for imitation. B cannot understand a message from A, just as he cannot imitate A, unless he is capable, or almost capable, of inventing or elaborating an analogous message himself. This almost is the secret, not only of communication, but of the indefinite progress of information in the real world. The trans-spatial world of essence and themes appears in order to complete the incomplete spatial system. What is implied by meaning, but is not actualizes itself freely.
Yeah, this bit about genetics or the role of the gene in evolution, I think is pretty interesting because DNA had been identified only a few years before this. This was like, sort of the high point of optimism about molecular biology, and the sort of, there's like the central dogma of molecular biology about how there would be this sort of linear flow of information from the gene to the protein, to the to the structure of the organism in general. And of course, today we know that that is a extreme oversimplification. And he was exactly right about about that. Basically at the time this was first introduced. Yeah, so as Angus mentions in the chat here, the bit about hormones is not exactly right, but he's exactly right, in saying that a gene is not something that is not like a sort of abstract pattern that gets imposed on an organism. It's essentially just a template to produce proteins, and then these proteins interact with each other in complicated ways, and genes get expressed or not depending on different factors in the cell, etc. So going from the gene to the observed phenotype of the organism is not this sort of linear process. There's like a handful of genes that have this very simple sort of Mendelian inheritance pattern where you can say that this eye color results from the presence or absence of a certain gene or a certain allele of a gene. But in most cases, some sort of observed trait of an organism is not something you can sort of trace back to one specific gene. There's like all kinds of factors that interact to produce this observed phenotype. And so he was like, some of the like specifics. Of course, he did not know exactly how these things work when biologists were just sort of starting to figure this out, to figure these things out. But the sort of general picture of regulation and interaction of all these different factors, he was, I think, exactly right. So yeah, he had a better sense of where things would end up 50 plus years later than I think a lot of the biologists did at that time. And then so this bit about when he turns to the sort of psychological side. So I think I actually had mentioned this example from Poincaré earlier, where he's talking about like he's trying to solve this mathematical problem, and he's doesn't really feel like he's getting anywhere, and then he goes out for dinner, and then when he like puts his foot on the sort of step of the streetcar, then he just sort of instantly understands the solution. And then when he gets home, he just writes it all down and checks that it's correct, and it all works just as he had sort of thought it would when he had that sort of sudden inspiration. And the way Poincaré describes this, he uses this sort of image of these atoms of ideas just sort of randomly bouncing off each other until they suddenly sort of click together. And Ruyer points out that this is maybe not that reliable as a description of the process, especially given that for the average person that just sort of takes these mathematical concepts, Fuchsian functions and non-Euclidean geometry, etc. If you just sort of like open a textbook and copy down these terms and on bits of paper, cut them up and put them in a hat and draw them out at random, your chance of generating a proof of the theorem that Poincaré had come up with are pretty small. It seems unlikely that the process going on in Poincaré's mind was something analogous to this kind of random collision of these atomic ideas that happen to generate a theorem. So it's the fact that Poincaré had a lot of mathematical knowledge coming in to this process that sort of gave him this I guess presentiment, as Ruyer puts it here, that certain combinations of ideas are promising and others don't make any sense. And so he doesn't know, obviously he doesn't know which combinations of ideas, which sort of chain of thoughts is going to lead to the proof of this theorem. Otherwise he would have already had the proof. But at the same time, he's not just sort of trying them completely at random. He's not just sort of groping in the dark. He has this sense of what are promising approaches and what are useless sort of dead ends. And there's some sort of obscure process going on even when he's not sitting at his desk, consciously aware of working on this problem that somehow gets to this result of grasping the solution to this problem when he's getting onto the streetcar. But it's pretty clear that this is not just this sort of random collision of these atomic ideas that sort of generates the theorem.
Yeah, the point about the prescience of his understanding or his criticism of gene-centric picture of development is very interesting. One of the cool things that I learned recently about the outcome of the Human Genome Project and how far it was from the picture of the genome that people thought that it would give us is that it turns out that only like 2% of the genome, the human genome, is kind of classically protein encoding in the way that people thought most of the genome was. But for much simpler organisms, like a lot of bacteria, it's closer to like 90% of the genome is directly protein encoding. A lot of the rest of the genome, human genome, which was thought to be like just junk DNA, turns out to be between like 30 and 80% encoding various regulatory, like long non-coding RNA that directs the much more complex and timing sensitive transcription process in the human being, other animals. And it seems like there's more of this kind of regulatory transcription and encoding happening the more complex the organism is, which is pretty interesting to think in relation to, Bergson's arguments about hesitation and complexity, but also Simon, his argument that complexity is, or really, what makes the difference between these domains of individuation is what he calls neoteny. So basically a slowing down. It's possible that, really what distinguishes the human development, or at least as a key distinguishing factor in human development from, like orangutan development, for instance, is just the timing of the expression of mostly identical genomes.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of domain in biology now, evolutionary developmental biology, evo-devo, which looks at this kind of, how evolution affects the developmental process of organisms, because maybe I guess up to maybe the 80s or 90s or so, when evo-devo sort of starts to come into prominence, evolutionary biology sort of focused on the adult organisms and the differences between the adult organisms found in population A and population B, and tracing the frequency of genes in these two populations and how that correlates with the phenotypic differences, etc. But there was no sort of or there was a lot less interest in sort of the mechanism that results in the differences in the adult organisms in these two populations. And often, or like one of the sort of common processes that leads to these differences in the adult organisms is, precisely as you were pointing to, the differences in timing, where a certain process is slower or faster in one population compared to the other, and that results in an organism that looks different, that has a different sort of general structure. Certain, maybe one organ is bigger or smaller compared to the other, etc. And so the differences that we observe in the traits of the organism, viewed from the outside, or viewed at a sort of large scale, are the result of changes in timing in the developmental process. And Ruyer points to the work of Darcy Thompson, who was kind of taken as like a sort of precursor of this kind of stuff. So he was writing in the early 20th century. He has the famous book is On Growth and Form, and he points to, so he thinks this is interesting, but he also thinks it's again sort of like a secondary process, and sort of taking this kind of change in timing to be like the central explanation for evolution. He takes this to be sort of a misguided, taking something secondary as if it were primary. So he talks about I forget the name of the fish. There's some kind of fish that has like a sort of huge jaw that you can, and Darcy Thompson shows how you can get this sort of strange fish from like a more typical fish form that was probably its ancestor, just by changing the timing of growth. And Ruyer says, yeah, that's interesting, and this it's quite useful in sort of tracing phylogeny, for example, which organisms, the relationships between different species, and when they diverge from each other and so on. But at the same time, taking a sort of typical fish structure and turning it into this weird fish with a giant jaw is something quite different from explaining where that typical fish structure came from in the first place. So it's the same type of problem as the zebra stripes, where the explaining where the stripes come from is maybe relatively straightforward once you already start with this horse type body, but explaining where the horse type body came from is a completely different level of difficulty. So I think he's in general sort of trying to keep us from losing sight of the core problem of like, where does this general body plan, where does this general structure come from, and trying to prevent us from getting sort of diverted by these these sort of secondary structural processes that he's not denying that they exist or that they're important, but he's also wants to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that these are sort of these presuppose the existence of the structure, the sort of overall structure of the organism, and can't therefore explain where that structure comes from in the first place. But yeah, this contrast between the bacterium and the human or like multicellular organisms in general, I think is quite interesting, because genetic engineering for bacteria is quite it's sort of like a banal process now in a lab, that you can like sort of swap in and out genes to like this is part of the production of different sort of pharmaceutical products now, that you just like insert a gene in the bacterium to produce a certain chemical, for example, or that that brings about the production of this chemical in the bacterium, and then you use that chemical as a sort of medical product. And this is like relatively well understood, because in part because the bacteria have this much more straightforward relationship between the gene and then the protein that gets expressed, that gets transcribed. But in the case of multicellular organisms, just swapping out one gene for another, or inserting this gene, it's often much harder to predict what the result will be, and it might depend not just on swapping this one gene for another, but what other genes are present in that organism, what the general sort of chemical environment, like what food the organism is eating, what and even things like we know that certain multicellular organisms, like there's fish, for example, that only undergo a certain developmental process based on what things they see around them. Where like if like there are too many female fish in the one in this population, one of them will become male. So here it's like observing what is surrounding it, and sort of detecting that there are no males present, and then that triggers this sort of chemical morphological process that turns the female fish male. So like here there are genetic or there's elements in the genome of this fish that allow for this process of transformation from female to male to happen. But the result that actually making that process happen is relies on this much more complicated sort of cognitive process of the fish recognizing these other fish are female, therefore I should turn male. And so this is obviously like a completely different level of complication compared to taking a bacterium and swapping one gene for another to produce this useful chemical that you want to use for medical purposes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things that I've been learning recently is that it sort of seems like the more complex an organism is, you could almost, like in some cases, it seems like that regulatory complexity, one of the advantages of it is a kind of noise resistance, even to, like misfirings at the level of the genome. So I read about this study, for instance, where there's a gene called P53, which encodes some crucial morphogen for cell division. and they knocked it out in these mice in like the very early embryos, but the mice nonetheless successfully underwent embryogenesis, and they had a tendency to develop tumors later on, probably because of this, the absence of this gene and whatever regulatory function it normally performs. But yeah, like I know that gene editing in humans has been undertaken for like sickle cell anemia, which is a pretty monogenic disease, and I think that the procedure was relatively successful. But other other phenotypes like height, for instance, I know it's like thousands of genes go into it, so it's a lot less clear how useful gene editing will be with most of the human phenotypes, which are not straightforward monogenic like sickle cell anemia.
Yeah, I think sickle cell anemia is like a one base pair deletion mutation, if I remember correctly, and that results in this protein that is used in the cell membrane of red blood cells that in low oxygen environments sort of collapses and then produces the sickle shaped cell that causes all the problems. Yeah, so if you can just sort of replace the gene that produces this sort of deviant protein with a normal one, then you would seemingly just solve the problem like that. But yeah, there are other genetic diseases where it's much less clear what the exact source of the problem is, and then all the sort of traits that are not exactly diseases, but where and this gets into all the sort of very dark corners of eugenics and things like that, about like producing humans that have these desirable traits that whoever's deciding what these traits are to be desired. Yeah, there's a lot of reason to think that it will not be possible, even if it were something that we wanted to do, to just sort of select that we're going to ensure that humans have this allele and not this other one, and that will produce the humans that have this desirable property. Since it's just the two of us, maybe we should stop here and pick up next time, if that's okay.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. So yeah, okay, we can stop here then. Yeah. So thanks, Angus. Thanks to those who had to leave early as well. Yeah, we'll pick up next time.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.